Name and address for the record, please.
My name is William Tam. I'm the Deputy Director of the Department of Land and Natural Resources for the Water Commission. You want home or business addresses? Business address is care of Department of Land and Natural Resources, 1151 Punchbowl Street, room 227, Honolulu 96813.
Morning, Mr. Tam.
Morning, Mr. Sykes.
First of all, you're appearing here pursuant to a subpoena that we served on you, is that correct?
That's correct. I'm not a voluntary witness. I'm here only pursuant to that subpoena.
And you are currently employed as a Deputy Director of the Department of Land and Natural Resources.
That's correct.
And what is your official title?
Deputy Director of the Department of Land and Natural Resources for the Commission on Water Resources Management.
And how long have you occupied that position?
I was appointed by Governor Abercrombie last year and began serving in January 2011.
Would you tell us a little bit about your academic background, starting with college?
I attended Wesleyan University in Connecticut, graduated with a degree in bachelor's in 1970 history. Spent a couple of years in the Peace Corps in West Africa, and then attended Boston University School of Law, graduated in 1976, came to Hawaii. Do you want a quick summary? Or?
Yeah, what was your first job in Hawaii?
I was recruited to work for Legal Aid Society, Kauai, and later...
So let's get that on the table. Who was it who recruited you?
Actually, you and Paul Olson recruited me sight unseen, thinking, of course, that I was Chinese.
Yes, indeed. That was our affirmative employment procedure at the time.
I've never sent my picture with my resume since.
So you worked for Legal Aid for how long?
4.5 years.
And after that, what was your next position?
I then became the Deputy Attorney General at the Attorney General's office representing the Board of Land and Natural Resources from 1982 to 1987. During that time, I was also involved when the Water Commission was created in 87 and represented the Water Commission from 87 to 97. While I was there, I was co-counsel in all of the state's water cases, Robinson versus Ariyoshi, which we prevailed on in the U.S. Supreme Court. I was counsel in the Mahalo case up through the contested case hearing. I was the principal co-author of the State Water Code.
And after that position as a Deputy Attorney General, what happened next?
I then became a counsel. I left the Attorney General's office in 97 and became a counsel at Olson Hunt Floyd Navy, where for 13 years I practiced water and natural resources law and did some Clean Water Act cases and continued to work on water issues.
What are your current duties in the position you now hold?
In terms of the Water Commission, I'm essentially the equivalent of an executive director of the Water Commission staff. Our staff has been cut from 24 to 13, so we are all of us working equal in 2 jobs right now. I oversee the overall responsibilities for the Commission, prepare or oversee the presentation of submittals to the Commission for action, as well as the long-term planning for the water use. In particular, there's a provision in the State Water Code requiring the integration of the water and land use planning in Section 31. And that's a task that involves coordinating with all the counties, with the federal government, with other state agencies. And it has been a long process since '87 to try to do that. And we are now trying to pick up the pace from where we were 15 years ago. So that is one of the major pieces we're involved with. I also, by virtue of my prior experience as counsel to the Land Department, get involved in a lot of other water-related matters, including the dam safety issues, including how it relates to agriculture. I am currently William Isla, who is the chair of the Land Board and the Water Commission, is appointed to the Ag Development Corporation Board. So I'm involved in a lot of the coordination with that. We're also involved with coordinating with the Department of Hawaiian Homelands and dealing with the water rights which they have under their statute as well as under the Water Code.
Are you involved at all in activities relating to Oahu's groundwater resources and the management of those resources?
Yes, I am. Initially back in 1992, when the first designation occurred, under the water code as it was initially enacted or initially anticipated, there will be one statewide law. In order to get that through the legislature, there was a compromise made whereby areas would be first designated for management that showed that there were problems coming up, and there were a series of triggers. And so in '92, the first trigger involved the wind reside of Oahu. So I was involved in that decision making, and then subsequently in overseeing both studies and the work of the commission with the USGS, with the Board of Water Supply, with the Army Corps, and with the Health Department to look at Oahu's groundwater and look at what we need to do prospectively in order to protect that.
And are there currently ongoing studies with respect to assessment of both current and future water resources for Oahu, and how planning and development of those resources should be engaged in?
Yes. Let me step back just a second. As most of you know, the Water Commission was created pursuant to a constitutional amendment in 1978 that was the result of an admonition by the White Supreme Court in the McBride litigation that making decisions about the future based upon sort of a rear view mirror of the law was not a useful way to go forward. And in the Constitution, there were a series of rights that were protected and a series of requirements to start to plan prospectively. And it took 10 years or 9 years after that constitutional amendment 78 to get a water code adopted. And there was a governor's commission, there was a legislative commission, and they established a framework. And that framework was a result of a number of meetings over a couple of years that led to a structure which probably no one themselves would have ever designed, but which everyone decided they could live with because it kept a balance of things. Part of the key of that whole arrangement is that we have to integrate science and land use and health issues into a single going forward model. As a consequence, we are now undertaking studies. First of all, I understand that Dr. John Blue has already testified before you. The Water Commission hired him a couple years ago to update his rainfall atlas. As you know, the rainfall atlas was first done essentially in 1986 based on some older data. So the data we've been using is more than 25 years old. He did that update. He prepared and finalized that report in October 2011. So we now have that information. It's online. I have some citations for the reference, for the record if you'd like, so you can get that, and a copy of sort of the basics of what he said, and I'm going to try to repeat what he's already apparently testified about. Secondly, we have ongoing contracts with the U.S. Geological Survey based on stream gauges, many of which are 80 or 90 years old. Unfortunately, because as the plantation agriculture has gone out, we've lost a lot of those gauges. Rain gauges and stream gauges it's hard to maintain, so our databases are getting thinner. It's also getting more expensive because of remote sensing issues. On Oahu, right now, we have a contract with the USGS and the Board of Water Supply to do two things. One, the USGS and Board of Water Supply are studying the Pearl Harbor area, and we separately with USGS are doing the rest of the island. Essentially, we're looking at what is called a recharge. The recharge is essentially rainfall, less evapotranspiration, less runoff that goes into the ground. Now, some of that water goes in the ground, then goes out toward the ocean, just by the natural process of things. Then from that, we calculate something called sustainable yield, or safe yield. That is a number, although it's a moving number, that is a rough estimate of the amount of water given the current infrastructure patterns, and that's really important to understand that, could be safely extracted to maintain a certain head level. Now, historically, what happened was around 1900, the head levels were high, and the plantation agriculture came in, and head levels dropped. In the 1970s, the sustainable yield in the Pearl Harbor region was thought to be around 225 million gallons a day you could take out. Now, that was predicated upon furrow irrigation, of which about 30% returned to the ground after you irrigated the sugarcane. It became more efficient, the sugar companies primarily, to change to drip irrigation because he would put the water right to the root of the plant. But it also meant there was less recharge into the ground. So over time, from the 70s and 80s going forward, as that changed his business practice, the amount of water that actually went back in the ground diminished. Concurrently, as lands were reclassified from ag to urban, and you got hard surfaces really lining town and so forth, that water, not only did the rainwater not go through, but there wasn't irrigation water, and it ran off. So that of course led to some soil erosion, and then would go into Pearl Harbor and into sediment loaded reefs. So that the conversion of land between an irrigation culture, if you will, and a hard urban surface alters the recharge and the sustainable yields in ways that most people don't quite anticipate. It's lost irrigation recharge, runoff, and the rain doesn't percolate through because it hits hard surface and runs off. So the dynamic is not just arithmetic, it's exponential. So we are studying these right now because the data on which we based our sustainable yield calculations, which is the best we have at the time, was pre-1986. So what we asked USGS to do, the water supply, is to go back and take Dr. Gianbaluca's new 2011 rainfall atlas and recalculate the recharge. Not yet the sustainable yield, but the recharge. Now there's another factor in this which has been the best science to date, but not good enough. We've also contracted with Dr. Gianbaluca to look at what are called evapotranspiration studies. And he gave a briefing to the commission, the Water Commission, back in December about the science of the evapotranspiration study. And it will probably be the first genuine state-of-the-art evapotranspiration study that's been done, and that's probably going to take another year. So it won't be until probably mid-2013 that we get both the new recharge, new sustainable yield, and then from the evapotranspiration studies for a while. This has implications in our water use plan because, very briefly, under the water code, there is a requirement for the counties to prepare water use and development plans, which is the attempt to integrate water and land use. City and County of Honolulu, back in 1992, like the other counties, prepared a plan, but it was basically not much more than an inventory, frankly. And so none of those plans were actually approved by the commission. And then there's a long period in between in which things have sort of not been done. And recently it's been geared up. The city and county has stepped up in a couple areas, but there are essentially 7 or 8 regions of Oahu. They've done Waianae, they've done Kolauloa, they've almost finished Kolaupopo. This is the draft which will go out to public hearing on Kolaupopo. As you can see, there's a lot of information in it. This was by comparison the 1990 plan for all the islands. This is the Waianae plan. This is the Kolauloa plan. So these are substantial pieces of work. The North Shore plan, I'm told, has started. There is a kickoff for EBA. Central Honolulu hasn't been started yet. And critically for this proceeding, also for the commission, Central Oahu has not been started. Now that creates a problem for us because that's the key source of our water. The Pearl Harbor Aquifer is generally been considered one of the finest natural aquifers in the world. It's been subject to the Bristol overpumping back in the 70s when the land board under prior authority started issuing water permits to restrict the pumping. It has also been subject to problems with heptachlor and some other agricultural pesticides and herbicides, and that's getting cleared up mostly. Last month, the commission approved a conceptual study of the potential reuse of wastewater and reclaim and stormwater for Central Oahu. Lake Wilson, as you know, has the city puts its R2 water, will be R1 water into Lake Wilson now. The Army has a R1 facility in Wheeler, which it treats as wastewater, and it's going to be reusing the wastewater back on its own land for landscaping and for the golf course. So the issue of how we reuse that water is going to be critically important. Right now, we estimate about 25 million gallons a day of potable water goes to non-potable purposes. But we're also faced with a problem, as Dr. John will probably testified, that the climate change issues and the decline in overall rainfall is going to have an impact on our aquifers. The basic takeaway that I take from what he said to the Water Commission in a couple of briefings is in the whole about a little bit more than 10% of the rainfall has declined relative in the last 20 years compared to the prior 50, which corresponds to the USGS calculation that undiverted streams over the last 80 years have declined somewhere between 10 and 15%. So if you take those as base levels, the numbers are trending down. And this has been true in our estimates we've obtained from hydrologists about groundwater on Oahu and on Maui. The early science, John Mink did a lot of the early work based on some earlier work by Stearns and others. And he said, this is a first best guess. And he recognized that the assumptions that he made will change. And so that's what we're faced with. We're faced with changing assumptions which are all tending to go smaller. The numbers of the sustainable yield calculations over time have not been going up, they've been going down. And some of it's just better science, so they're measuring better. So it's not actually conditions in the field change, but it's better measurements. But there's a danger in assuming that these numbers are hard numbers the same way you think of a bank account or a survey as being hard numbers. They're not. Water moves and it changes and it affects everything. It's not like a plot of land where you can sort of look at it and see what it's about. It integrates land use and our needs for water in a variety of ways. It ends up in the ocean, comes back around. So it's a more complex understanding than simply, here's a survey of the land, here's what you do. That's why these studies are so important, because it's an attempt to bring together what's the effect on the forest. I mean, if in fact the rain clouds are getting narrower, hitting the mountains, and there's less water coming in, and the exotics are moving out, and the invasives are coming in, we're losing our ability to capture the water. Now that has major consequences for everyone. It's not just one location. One of the things that is also, I think, hard to switch on, and this is something that you as the Land Use Commission, we as the Water Commission, and the Land Board have some special responsibilities about. And that is our timeframes are often too short. We're making decisions that will affect people essentially for the future, not simply today. So there's a danger that you tend to look at numbers in these charts, for example, say, okay, here's how much we're pumping, here's how much the sustainable yield is, like a bank account, I can write a check on the difference. It doesn't work that way. First of all, the numbers are, however good the science may be, are like putting thermometers, if you will, down into a black hole to see what's down there. We don't know. A simple example, on the Big Island, they're finding deep, 500 million year old water under Mahalo. Who would have known? The science is changing rapidly on that. So we're faced with making decisions about a long future. So when you folks have to think about a decision, it's not going to just be 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, you're talking 50 to 100 years. When the Water Commission is making decisions likewise, we are increasingly having to realize once you make commitments, it's very hard to withdraw them. Once you change from ag-urban, for example, it tends to be an inelastic demand. It's not like agriculture, which can come and go a little bit. So the kinds of understanding we have to do with water is much more complex than here's a permit or here's a check on a bank account. There are a couple other factors that are often overlooked and have slowly been integrated into this, and that has to do with water quality. The USGS is now measuring in parts per trillion, not per billion, but trillion. And so as they do that, and the health department starts to catch up with these measurements, we're going to find things. There's no way around it. And so the issue of water quality is going to raise its head more dramatically in the future than it has in the past. Hawaii, for example, the soils in Hawaii have a high level of arsenic in it. It's just the way it is. There are places where there are dioxins. There's the remnants of 100 years of agriculture. The EPA and the Clean Water Branch are struggling with some of these new problems. And the regulatory regime has not caught up yet. Even the measuring and the science hasn't caught up yet. So there's some things out there we're going to have to be aware of. There are more and more sort of forces that are beginning to converge, and we're trying to get our hands on this by working with people more and more. There have been, in the last 100 years in Hawaii, some very significant litigation over water issues. That has sort of framed where we got to, and finally with the water code, we've created an instrument to go forward rather than just looking back. Nonetheless, we have a lot of things we have to take care of. We have some constitutional obligations to Native Hawaiians with regard to taro, with regard to riparian rights, with regard to how those practices are carried out. We have some obligations with the federal government with regard to water quality, with regard to how we manage our nearshore waters. This is an aside. One of the things we're doing, we're about to sign an agreement with the Army Corps and other federal agencies to look at West Maui as a model for what happens to what you do on the land and how does that affect the ocean and nearshore fisheries. Because our agricultural practices impact what goes on in the ocean. So this integration of water and land use, which has been slowly coming, is now coming much more quickly. And it's a long answer to your question, but there is no simple way to figure out what's this going to look like in 50 or 60 years, because the more we sort of fix in commitments, the less flexibility we're going to have for the next generation to deal with the things they're going to have to deal with. We don't want to foreclose the future generations from having some options in their life. And the difficulty is the more we build our infrastructure a particular way, the more we're going to be tied into that delivery system. And one of the problems that happened in Pearl Harbor was the wells were largely drilled close to each other, close to Waipahu, close to Pearl Harbor, right Malco there. And they were, obviously, you don't want to have to build more pipeline than you wanted in order to get the water out. So you're building wells often close, deep, and big. Well, all those wells are like straws, all drawn from the same bottom part of the soda, if you will. And they start to interfere with each other. So one of the things the Board of Water Supply is having to do over time is cut back, if you will, or stop pumping the big, deep wells that are close to the ocean. Because what happens is it pulls up, it sucks up that bottom, and you get this cone of depression that brings up salt water. Sea level rise and desalinization aside, that problem alone has the danger of making brackish what is otherwise potable water. So you want to spread out your pumps and your wells, ideally in a pattern where you're skimming off the top of the whole aquifer. But we don't actually know, despite all the wells that are out there, what that always looks like. That's why the sustainable yield is not the same as the recharge. The recharge may be a mathematical calculation of how much water is going in the ground, but how much you can take out is a function of where your wells are. If they're too close to each other and they start interfering, you can't pump them at a maximum level. If you don't distribute them evenly, then you can't take out that sustainable yield, which is a magical number. But the reality is, it's not actually that number. It's what you can do without hurting each other's wells. Some of that water may be purchased in a place you just can't get to, and yet mathematically that number is there. One thing that we've been very interested in trying to do in that regard is look at the cost benefit of the conservation versus new source development. During the WILLIAM hearings 15 years ago, I guess, Board of Water Supply testified that if they had to do new source development on Oahu, where they know there's water, which is on the North Shore, it's such great distance, and they have to go so deep. Then estimate was approximately $7 million to drill a well to get 1 million gallons out. Not the operating expense, capital expense. So we started asking the question, what if you took the same $7 million, invested it in the forest, capture the water, would you get more water into your ground, which is the best storage you can have, use your existing infrastructure so you don't have to drill a new well, and get more water out that way? Could you just demonstrate on a cost-benefit basis that conservation makes more sense than new source development? The answer seems to be yes, pretty clearly. But it's more difficult to organize that because you have to deal with multiple landowners who own the watersheds. And they're all starting to head in that direction because they realize the truth of it. Not only do you help your watershed in terms of the native forests and the rain capture, you don't have to put in more infrastructure, so you use the existing infrastructure. And it's on a pure cost-benefit basis, it makes more sense to do that. As you may know, the Department of Land and Natural Resources has, in light of this, initiated something called the Rainfall is the Rainforest, which is a program. I've got a site for our website, a white paper we presented to the legislature and others to do precisely that. Our goal was to take $11 million, $1 million per watershed in each of the 11 watershed partnerships across the state, and essentially hire more professional staff to go and identify the best places to fence out, frankly, the ungulates are the problem. And we only fence about 4% of the forestry now, 10% into the state land, and we're losing it. And if you simply would start to fence out those critical places where you know the rain's going to come down, make sure you kept the native forest. I mean, these are very mountain areas. These are not close down. And we could, one, save some of the native forest, but two, help with our recharge in a serious fashion. Because as those invasives go up the mountain, like strawberry guava has a very high evapotranspiration rate. It not only evaporates out, it also takes water out of the ground. It's everywhere. In that white paper we did at the very back, not the one on the website, but I've got a copy to show you. Essentially, strawberry guava is moving and taking over our forests. Summer Urban, who's on the Water Commission, owns Ulapalakua Ranch. In his lifetime, he's watched certain weeds and certain invasives come from an 800-foot level up to about a 1,300-foot level. In one person's lifetime, he's seen that happen to his own cattle ranch. And he's really very concerned. This is something that's really important to him because if we don't reverse this process or stop it, essentially, you're not going to have cattle if you don't have water. So the future of Hawaii's agriculture depends on this in a way that people haven't thought about before. There's a similar parallel going on because, again, this is how these things get related. After the Cloquet Dam breach in 2006, the legislature passed an act in 2007 to say, you've got to bring your dams up to speed. We have 138 regulated dams. They're mostly 80-year-old earthy dams built during the plantation era. And there's a lot of people going, oh, it's expensive to fix it. But if we don't keep it, if we don't keep that storage capacity, in about 10 years when I don't know if Tom talked about that in his testimony, but there's a phenomenon called the Pacific Decadal Oscillation that occurs as a weather pattern north of the Hawaiian Islands. It's about a 20 to 30-year cycle. We happen to be, believe it or not, in a slightly wetter phase of that for the next 10 years. We have a little breathing room right now. But in about 10 years, that cycle, which is like a sine curve, is going to go into its down cycle, which means the leeward sides of the island are going to get much drier. Now, if we don't have our storage capacity to capture the rain as well as the forest, the leeward sides of the island, look what's going on in Kona, are going to suffer in ways we haven't yet anticipated. So our goal from the dam safety side is actually to help landowners keep their dams and to bring them up to speed. Now, the problem is they're all 80-year-old earthen dams, with one exception. We've got to meet the FEMA standards. We can't have it under local. So it's got to get fixed. But if we do fix them, and we get the irrigation system back working, and the governor and the legislature appropriating funds to do a lot of this, we have the ability to store that water, and that storage capacity can be critical in the dry season and in downtime. If we don't have that storage capacity, agriculture is not going to work. In fact, we are going to have trouble with drinking water problems. And so one of the things we did, unrelated issues here, but we've actually proposed a constitutional amendment to allow special projects bonds in some instances that would qualify so that we can issue bonds to help fix the reservoirs and pay them back over a period of time. So the problems we're facing are integrated. They're not, you can't just sort of break it off and say, okay, we're going to do this without regard to what it means elsewhere. The agricultural practices with soil, for example, in West Maui, the runoff that occurs off Lahaina. And the Army Corps has been working on building sediment basins, but we need to develop much more nuanced, smaller kinds of remedies that work in communities Look at the South Shore of Molokai or off Halayankala. That area had once been forested and inhabited and supported agriculture. Wines had check dams in these gullies that would keep, as the rainwater would come down, collect the soil, build up an area, and that's where you grow your food. So the areas, the dryland forests even were very productive, but we've degraded them terribly. Luwano in 1900 was denuded of trees. And they started replanting them because they were worried not about the forest per se, but about their water supply. They understood back then, that's how the forestry division got started, to protect the water sources. So they understood how they treat their land is critical to their long-term water supply. We're relearning what people knew a long time ago, we forgot. And so the Water Commission, like you folks and like the Land Board, is having to relearn some old knowledge. And these plans look sort of, it's a lot of material to read, and a lot of material to assimilate. But what we think this will do is use these plans, use these scientists, use the experiments we're doing to get people to have a conversation about how we do this in a new way. Going through contested cases, notwithstanding everything you folks are going through today, is one way to learn a new area. But once you've learned it, you shouldn't have to go through this again and again. And we're trying to use advanced working groups to get people to start to have this dialogue. On Maui, in Kona, I was in Kona last week, talking to folks there. We're trying to get the National Park Service, the land users, the hydrologists, the geologists, to have more of a conversation so we can head off conflicts. I've been through two of the largest contested cases in the history of Hawaii, the Campbell geothermal projects and the Waihole project, which went on for years. That was a very intense way to learn the lesson. We don't have to do that again if we start some of these coordinating, some of this integration. There are a lot of tools in the water code. It is not a formal logic that you can follow and get the answer. Just like the decisions you have to make, it's not just one formal logic, it's a series of values you've got to integrate. What we'd like to do, actually I came 10 years ago or 12 years ago, I came before your predecessors at the Land Use Commission, and we spent a couple hours talking about this. And unfortunately, institutional knowledge sometimes gets lost, but it's something we hope to do more in the future. And frankly, I'd like to offer an invitation. Maybe we can get the Water Commission and you folks to sit down together sometime. The way my style is, come to my kitchen, have a cup of coffee, let's talk story. Because I think we need to understand the tasks both of us face. You have the land, we have the water. Land Board's got the Conservation District. These are all critical, interrelated activities. Not sure what else I want to.
I think we could stop there. I don't have any further questions because although I have a bunch of questions, you've answered them all. So at this point, I have no further questions. Thank you.
Petitioner.
Mr. Tam, from what you just stated, I gleaned basically 3 points of what you're saying. Maybe there's a fourth or fifth. I might have missed it. Correct me if I'm wrong. One is you're saying that the nature of water is a resource, which is affected by many factors: weather, soil conditions, geological formations, etc. That it's very difficult to predict the future of water resources because, first of all, it's very difficult to predict what the weather patterns might be, for instance. Is that one of your...
Not quite. Let me add one of the things before I should have said this the right beginning. I'm here by virtue of a subpoena. The Water Commission does not take a position with regard to this application because it may face the very application in the future. And so I've avoided talking about the specifics of this application and will not, just because we can't be in a position of commenting directly on the particular facts if, in fact, we are later facing the same application. So please don't take my testimony as suggesting a supporter, the commission supports or opposes the project. We can't say anything about that. I'm here to help and provide you as another commission with information about what we do and what we think needs to be done. Now, to your particular point, I don't think we can say it's unpredictable, we don't know anything, we know a lot. We're talking about the range of uncertainty that exists within trends we already know. And we know, for example, that sustainable yields on Oahu have changed over time, and we have volumes of information about that. We can't speak with it with a mathematical certainty the same way you do like a survey line. Okay? So the uncertainties levels we're talking about are factors that we're discovering, but the trends and the overall structure of the situation is pretty well documented.
Well, I was, going back to Professor Gianmaluca, he mentioned that he had done that survey, the annual rainfall survey in 1986 that you mentioned, is that correct?
That's my understanding.
And I gathered that in that study, he used data that he had gathered at that time based on the best information that he was receiving. And then he also used certain assumptions in terms of his methodology. And one of the assumptions he mentioned yesterday was, I believe I get this correct, assumption of stationarity. That was the basis of his rainfall study in 1986. What he testified yesterday was that climatologists have discovered that that particular base assumption of the methodology that was used in 1986 is invalid. And so they developed a new set of assumptions, I presume, that he has used for the current study. I'm not sure if 20 years from now climatologists will find that those assumptions are invalid. And what I was trying to get at is that the nature of the art or the science of climatology is unpredictable insofar as predicting what future weather patterns might be 1 day from now, a year from now, or 10 years from now. Would you agree with that?
Well, it's hard to respond to that because clearly the quality of the science has gotten better everywhere. That's not to say you have certain knowledge, and there's a certain randomness in events that are difficult to predict. But the consequences on the ground are apparent. It is clear that we have declining groundwater sources. It is clear that the stream water flows and underwater streams have diminished. It's clear that invasive plants are moving up a mountain due to changes in climate. So, I mean, the consequences are more visible. Now, whether the science could predict in the same way that a mathematical equation can get you a fixed number, I don't disagree that that's changing. But it's not sufficient to say, well, we don't know anything. No, we know a great deal. The science is getting better. I mean, physics has gotten more elaborate over time, which is not to say we figured out the four fundamental forces of the universe in a more, well, with some more precision, but the uncertainty exists because the quality of work is getting better. Nothing's ever going to be final, but we do see the trends and the consequences.
Well, all I'm saying is that based on historical patterns of weather, I believe what Dr. Gianmaluca is saying is that it still is difficult to predict what the future trends are going to be, simply because we don't know. I mean, weather patterns are somewhat unpredictable. I think you would agree with that.
They're somewhat unpredictable, but when you look at USGS data on stream gauges, for example, on underverted streams, if you go over 80 years, the trend is down. We may not know on a day-to-day basis which number it is because Hawaii streams are short and flashing. When you get a rainfall event and you get a 10 times increase in the volume going down that stream, unlike the mainland, which are more steady. So it's an ecology that's different than the mainland, and it's a varied ecology. And it will vary from year to year, but to say it varies doesn't mean we don't know directions.
What I'm saying is that Dr. Gianmaluca seemed to indicate that the rainfall has been decreasing over the last 20 years.
If you look at his rainfall atlas, his summary suggests, and I don't want to misstate him, that in the last 20 years there appears to have been a decline of about 10%, maybe more in some cases, of the aggregate rainfall compared to the prior 50 years. Now, those are statistical kinds of calculations. They're very subject to a lot of statistical recalculation. Notwithstanding that, we do see trends, the same way we see a general trend in climate temperature. I mean, it's not that it won't change from day to day, week to week, month to month, but if you look at long-term trends and the consequences, those trends are more generally accepted now. Not to say that we have certainty.
I don't disagree with you. I think he's saying that there's a trend over the last 20 years of declining rainfall. All I'm saying is that because of the nature of the science and the methodology being used, and also, as you just mentioned, the data cases and such are being compromised because of economics of it and whatever, that predicting the future and extrapolating that the same trends are going to continue is problematic, at least.
Yes and no. I mean, I can't accept the notion that we don't know certain things. The fact that there's some uncertainty, that's true, about getting up in the morning. But that doesn't mean we don't go to work. So I'm not inclined to accept the proposition we don't have information about trends because we have to make judgments based on the information we have. We have a lot of information.
Exactly. As you said, we go to work. The next day, we have to go to work, which is my next point. In light of this uncertainty that you've mentioned, commissions like this particular commission must make decisions on petitions that are currently before them based on the best information that they have. At the present time, at the Waipahu-Waialba Aquifer, as I understand it, they're based on the testimony of Mr. Nance, who preceded you, there is about 104 million gallons per day sustainable yield in that particular aquifer. Is that, do you agree with that?
I have to look at the charts. I don't remember all of them.
Mr. Nance also testified that 85 million gallons of that 104 is permitted, but only 55 million gallons per day is actually used. And the testimony of Mr. Usagawa from the Board of Water Supply explained that the difference is because many of the permitted uses are using conservation measures such as no water, flush toilets, et cetera, et cetera. And these conservation measures have resulted in significant reductions in the actual uses that were requested via the permits. So therefore, the actual usage today is around 55 million gallons. So the difference between 104 and 55 million gallons is available in the Waipahu-Waialba Aquifer. This particular project will be applying for that particular amount of water. Would you say that there's sufficient water for this project, potable water for this project, based on that information?
I can't make that judgment. First of all, as I mentioned earlier, because this matter may become before the commission, I can't make an ultimate judgment on those ultimate decisions. But one of the things I'm trying to bring to the commission's attention is you can't look simply. This is a generic problem. It's not just this application. You can't look simply at what the current sustainability is, what the current pumpage is, and say it's available. That's the checkbook account kind of logic. The question we have to look at is 58 years from now, when the entire region has land use, what does the allocation look like? There's a lot of water that's not being pumped now because agriculture has declined in central water. But if it comes back and it needs water, where's that going to come from? So there are lands like Dole, for example, Kamehameha Schools in the North Shore. They're not in production now, but they anticipate being in production. So the decision that that water is, quote, available sort of miscasts the notion that we're going to make a decision right now about everything, or it's first come, first served. Now, water law in Hawaii is not first come, first served. That's something people don't understand. This is not a prior appropriation state. Unlike the Western United States, this is a riparian and correlative rights state. And what that means in water law terms is it's a shared use doctrine. It happens to correspond to the old Hawaiian practices, but in Western law, the correlative is that Hawaii, on a stream or in the groundwater, you share your use. First come, first served does not apply. Now that's going to be a shock to a lot of people, but it's actually the old Hawaiian style, and it's actually what they have to do in an island. Because if you deny a landowner the ability to drill a well in 1929 in the civil Sudi Mill case, Hawaii Supreme Court expressly said that when we decide what the water code does to it. The notion that I got here first, therefore it's mine, or I get first use of it. You might have a temporary use of it, but at some point you may have to cut back. One of the things that is in the Water Commission permits, and one of the things we haven't faced yet, which we will at some point, is the situation when we have finally allocated out an area. Now, it's not as apparent on the wall, but if you think of Molokai, the sustainable yield will all go up for maybe 7 million, maybe 5, maybe 3. So it's a small number. Now, Hawaiian Homes happens to have a first call on water on public lands. It hasn't used the water it needs yet. But if Hawaiian Homes comes along and says, by the way, we need this water for our project, by federal law, under the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and by virtue of the Admissions Act, and the state constitution, Hawaiian Homes will get a first call on that water. That means we may have to cut back somebody that's currently using water. Now, we haven't reached that level yet, but people need to understand this. I represented the state for 9 or 10 years in Robinson litigation. It was a takings case. And the predicate of that was that someone had a right to own water. Well, that doctrine is dead. But the problem is going to arise if we as a water commission, for example, are required to, or do grant a permit to someone. 10 years from now, it turns out we have maxed out our allocations. If somebody else comes along and says, I want to drill a well on my land here. They have a right to drill a well. They have a right to take some water. We don't know how much. But we're going to at some point get to the place where we have to pull back water from existing users. That day's coming. Now, having done takings law for a long time, I'm also familiar with this area of law, it's going to be tricky, but it's going to happen. And so we've got to start to think about, as we approach that asymptotic curve, what kind of commitments we're making to people that we know we may have to tell them to cut back. Now, we're going to have a cushion for a while with conservation, efficiency, better measures, the very points that he was making a moment ago. They're only going to take us so far. I don't know how long, 20 years, 25, 30. But by the time your grandchildren are sitting in your seats, they're going to be faced with a whole other task. They're going to be faced with the task of rolling back uses because somebody else has a legitimate claim to do something, take some water from that well. That's where we're headed. This is an island. There's no Colorado River, and the desalt option is a very, very expensive proposition. So I don't presume desalt is going to do anything more than in isolated places provide water that otherwise can't be available, but to have the entire social system of this island depend upon desalinization plants with very high energy costs is a proposition I don't encourage you to look at very much as an answer.
Mr. Tatum?
That's a long answer to your question.
Very well. Okay, I didn't mean you to go off and lecture.
No, I'm just trying to connect the dots.
I'd like to ask you if, I know you've been subpoenaed to be here today.
Yes.
Were you able to look at the OOPD conceptual water master plan filed in this particular petition and done by Bill's Engineering?
I've read it. I'm reluctant to comment on, because I don't have a working knowledge of it. I intentionally avoided trying to learn the details of it so I wouldn't be asked ultimate questions on the question of that.
Are you aware that no new wells will be required for this particular project?
As proposed, I understand that may be the case.
Now, you talked about protecting the watershed as a way to improve the efficiency of recharge. And that means, as I take it, maintaining our forest lands, the mountain areas especially, planting trees, etc., to capture more of the water, so that more of the rainfall is able to be recharged through the ground and into our aquifers. Is that?
Yes, that's a program we're trying to support right now because we're actually losing our native forest very rapidly.
Are you familiar with the OOPD lands?
Not personally.
They're located.
I mean, I know where they are, but I haven't walked through there.
Those are relatively flat lands in Eva. They're, as I understand it, over the Eva Cap Rock. Do you consider those lands to be in the watershed area?
They're not watershed, no, but all lands receive rainfall.
The reason I'm asking you this is that a witness yesterday I believe it was Mr. Martinez, I could be wrong, made a statement that we shouldn't be building homes or other structures on flatlands like Ho'opili. Instead, we should be building homes on the mountains and in the valleys. Would you agree with that position?
I'm going to object if that correctly states the testimony. The testimony was a little bit more sophisticated than that, but if he can answer the question, then proceed.
I don't know of all, I don't know the testimony, first of all. I don't recommend building homes in watershed areas because by definition, they're probably in the conservation protected subzones. So you probably can't build there anyway. But the watershed areas that are mouth of watersheds are the areas we need to protect as watersheds.
Now, are you aware that most of the whole PD project site overlies the Pu'uloa sector of the Eba Caprock?
Yes.
And it doesn't overlie the Waipahu Waiawa Aquifer. It's over the Eba Caprock area.
There may be, I'm not sure exactly where the boundary lines are off the top of my head, but I know roughly where it is.
Okay. Isn't it true that a majority of the recharge that the whole PD project site goes into, in other words, the rainfall that falls on the whole PD site goes into the Eba Caprock aquifer rather than the Waipahu Waiawa aquifer?
That's my understanding, but I don't have the hydrologic maps.
And that the Eba Caprock aquifer is a non-portable caprock aquifer.
That's generally correct, yes.
It is salt water.
It's brackish.
Brackish water.
Yes.
I have no further questions.
County?
Morning, Mr. Pat. As you know, the whole PD project is going through a land use approval process. I just want you to describe briefly how the Commission on Water Resource Management fits into the land use approval process and integrates into that process from the approvals of various agencies.
How the commission itself works?
Yeah, and how approvals for water allocations work.
Okay. Chapter 174C, which is the water code, provides that in areas that are designated for water resource management, this is an area that is a designated water management area, all water uses must have a water use permit. Now, that does not include systems totally on the Board of Water Supply. The Board of Water Supply has large permits for its internal processes. But in terms of individual wells or surface water uses that divert from the stream, a landowner in a designated water management area must obtain a water use permit. Now, for groundwater, that involves, first of all, installing a well and a pump installation, getting a pump installation permit, and testing it so you figure out whether that well is going to interfere with the surrounding wells and what its pumping capacity is and what it will do with the sustainable yields. For surface water, but I take it, there's no surface water in this land, so I'm not sure that's what it's going into. There's a separate set of issues involving water use permits and stream flow standards, stream diversion work permits. With regard to the groundwater, however, the principal first question is what does that well do to the surrounding areas? Is there potable water that can be pumped? Historically, it has been the case because we haven't been close in many areas that when an application comes in and there's enough water and sustainable yield, then the permit has generally been granted. There is a provision in the code, the Water Commission just went through this last month actually, with regard to Waialua, where there's been a long period of non-use. Actually, some of the people gave up their permits, and then some people have been reapplying and get that water. The longer-term issue, which is going to become important to the Commission, is going to be not simply looking at wells on a case-by-case basis, but looking at a region and saying, how does this whole region work? Because as I mentioned earlier, the location of wells is critical for well interference issues, and it's also critical in terms of maximizing, actually, the amount of groundwater you can take out so that you don't put too many wells close to each other. So those are the kinds of patterns you look at. The Commission is required to follow the plans that are prepared under the water use and development plans, the state water resource protection plan, which looks like this. And these are plans that have been put together over a period of 20, 25 years and are periodically updated. They're living documents. They're not just a one-time event. So there are a series of tests that you go through for a water use permit under the code. I won't bother with all those details that are in the statutes. We have to make sure we don't interfere with existing water uses. They must be reasonable and beneficial, which is a term of art defined in the code. It must be not interfere with Hawaiian homes needs. There are a whole series of criteria that if you meet those statutory criteria, then permit issues.
So there will be permits that will be necessary for this project to progress.
My assumption is they will come in, yes, if the project proceeds, and they're not doing agriculture, yes, then the project will have to get water use permits.
And for those water use permits, all of the factors that you mentioned, including sustainable yield, water management, and design practices will be taken into consideration by the commission?
Yes.
And the commission would make a burden or the best decision that they can with respect to all of these factors as to how much water there is, and yield, and all of those factors. So this commission, land use commission, will just need to have an understanding of the basic tenets of water resource management in order to make an educated decision. Because if in fact it goes through a water permit process, then the minutia of sustainable yields and all of that will be taken into consideration at that time.
Yes and no. It's not sufficient to simply say, clearly the commission, water commission will have to go through that process and analyze it. But what's important is not to be confined, if you will, to looking at all these as one-offs. The point of what I was explaining earlier is there's an integration now that has to occur between water and land use that has been a long time in coming. And so it's really critical that people think about the regional issues and understand that. So it's not simply, we're going to pass this off to somebody else.
Right.
The commission, water commission, will have to do what you say.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that the minutia and the details of sustainable yield and all of that will be addressed by the water commission.
We wouldn't call it minutia.
Well,
but the details of sustainable yields and those calculations will have to come before the commission. Water.
Yeah, well,
That's correct.
minutia is not a good word.
Not to me.
The details and
Thank you.
the,
Yes.
okay. I have no further questions.
Steve, questions? Dr. Dungy?
I'd like to go back to the desalinization. The Board of Water Supply has publications to say that they're going to start desalination in 2018. And you talked about the carrying capacity of the island. And are you telling us that if there is only going to be spot use of desalination, that we need to become aware of carrying capacity for the island? And do you ever see that we're going to go into limiting in-migration because of the lack of water?
That's a very big question, and I'm not qualified to speak on those broad issues. My hesitancy on desalinization has to do with some experience I had back in the early 90s, reviewing some of the projects in Hawaii when I was in the Attorney General's office. And the cost, the amount of energy required, how do you treat the brine. Now clearly the technology's improved significantly in 20 years. What concerns me is, and clearly desalinization is used in isolated places where you have no choice. Saudi Arabia does it, I think South Africa does it, Santa Barbara does it, San Diego does it, I believe. But I'm skeptical of large-scale reliance on it. That's the problem. And it's because when you it's like leveraging yourself off the end of the diving board and saying, you're going to count on the water being there if you haven't checked it. It's not, you can clearly do it. Clearly the technology's there. It's getting better. No question about it. But it's taking a risk if you're counting on it for a large-scale supply on that. Now, someday that may happen, but I'm inherently skeptical of those kinds of solutions when we have so many obligations.
Okay, and so basically what you're saying is we should work with the water we've got rather than think about desalination.
Well, we will be working with the water we have, so I'm not counting on having new water separate from what the natural world provides right now. That's my obligation right now.
Thank you.
Ms. Yurko?
No questions.
Reader?
No further questions?
Commissioners, any questions? Commissioner Heller?
I know you're trying to avoid expressing specific opinions on this particular parcel of land, but I just like to kind of be clear if we can on the bottom line here. The question before us is classification of this parcel as either agricultural or urban. And potentially that can have an impact on both the supply of water and the demand for water. As to supply, if I understood correctly, you're basically saying that the use of this parcel in and of itself would probably not have much impact on the supply of potable water at least, because it's mostly above the cap rock and it's not going into the potable water aquifer, is that right?
That's a fair summary, yes.
Okay. On the demand side, are you expressing any opinion as to whether the use of this particular parcel in agriculture versus urban would have a significant effect on the overall demand for water?
I'm not going to express an opinion on that on behalf of the commission. I'm trying to just simply bring to your attention what the consequences are in the long term on a regional basis. So I'm going to reserve for the commission to make a decision about that when they face that issue, if they do.
Okay. And I understand your point about, the difficulty of making long-term predictions and all of that, but as a general principle, is the water demand greater in agricultural use or greater in urban use, or is that something you can identify either way?
Agricultural use can be greater in different time periods, but it is also more elastic. You may fallow fields, you may not plant for a while. Its actual aggregate demand varies because you may have some fields in production, other fields not. So it's much more variable. If you think of diversified ag as requiring somewhere between 2,500 and 3,500 gallons per acre per day, calculate that also in what crops you have, how you rotate them. It's a much more flexible arrangement, but the aggregate water is usually higher. Urban demand, once you commit, is fairly fixed. And you can do some conservation. You can essentially commit to that amount of water based upon whatever the densities are. That's pretty much there. The other aspect of that is that once you harden the surface, you tend not to then have much recharge, and you end up with runoff, which creates other sets of problems. So it's not a linear kind of relationship.
Thank you.
Commissioners, any other questions? Thank you for your testimony.
Thank you.
Music and you cannot handle, and then you wanna shut us up so you start screaming scandal. You say we're fighting for no reason and that we only fail. If intelligence is a crime, then I belong in jail. No more watching the world go by, my friend. Somebody gonna die if I see my tutu cry again. Hawaiian man, Hawaiian land. I rap there for YM, and if you ask me why I rap Hawaiian, then I tell you cause I can. You cannot understand, so you start dissing. The last person that tried to shut me up is still missing. This This is the land, so tell me why must we pay rent? If I happen to ignore you, it's because you're ignorant. Pidgin is the dialect that I select when I talk. Ikia oike o little Hawaii, but tell me, can you walk the walk? You say library, I say library. I tell you why I call it the library, cause that's where they bury all the lies you can't believe. Everything you read, the words of our kupuna is all you really need, and then you tell me that I'm arrogant because I call you ignorant. When it's apparent that you're blaming me for your stupidity, when you should blame your parents. Pilgrims, that's the way it is. Not prejudice, I'm just telling it like it is. My words upset your belly just like indigestion. To snap or not to snap, that is my question.